Close your eyes and imagine the slow passage of time. Imagine 26 centuries flowing past like water in a great river. Imagine empires rising and falling, languages spoken and then forgotten, cities built and then returned to dust. In the northern reaches of what is now Iraq, along the eastern bank of the Tigris River, there are mounds. Simple mounds of earth, covered in grass and scrub, baked by the sun, cooled by the night. These mounds have names. Tel Nebi Yunus, which means the hill of the prophet Jonah, and Kuyunjik, an ancient name whose meaning has been lost to time. For centuries, these mounds were simply part of the landscape. Farmers grazed their sheep on them. Children played on their slopes. The earth was silent, keeping its secrets. But beneath the surface, beneath layers of soil and sediment, beneath the accumulated dust of millennia, there lay one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. There lay Nineveh. In the middle of the 19th century, a young Englishman named Austen Henry Layard came to this region. He came with curiosity, with determination, with a belief that these silent mounds concealed something extraordinary. And when he began to dig, when his workers' shovels broke through the surface and reached down into the earth, they found wonders. They found massive stone bulls with human heads and eagle wings. They found palace walls covered in carved reliefs, showing kings and battles and hunts. They found cuneiform tablets by the thousands. They found Nineveh. The rediscovery was a sensation. Museums in London and Paris filled with treasures from the mounds. Scholars learned to read the ancient Akkadian language, preserved on clay tablets. The world remembered what had been forgotten, that here, on this spot, had stood one of the mightiest cities of antiquity, capital of the Assyrian Empire, home to perhaps 100,000 souls at its height. But the excavations revealed something else as well. They revealed destruction, not the gentle decay of abandonment, but the violent trauma of catastrophe. Everywhere the archaeologists dug, they found the same story, written in ash and broken stone. They found fire. They found collapse. They found the unmistakable evidence that Nineveh had not faded away peacefully, but had been destroyed utterly, violently, completely. This is the story we will explore together, slowly and thoroughly, as you drift towards sleep. This is the story of how archaeology confirms, through hundreds of individual pieces of evidence, that the ancient city of Nineveh fell to a coalition of enemies in the year 612 BC and never rose again. We will walk through the evidence piece by piece, layer by layer, as archaeologists themselves must work with patience and careful attention to detail. There is something deeply calming about archaeological evidence. It does not shout. It does not demand. It simply waits, buried in the earth, for someone to notice it, to record it, to understand what it means. Each broken brick, each layer of ash, each fragment of carved stone is a quiet witness to events that happened so long ago that they have passed beyond human memory into the realm of deep history. So settle yourself comfortably. Let your breathing slow. Let your muscles relax. We are going to take a long journey through time and earth, examining the destruction of Nineveh as archaeologists have uncovered it, fact by fact, layer by layer, with all the patience that such work requires. Before we can understand the destruction, we must first understand what was destroyed. We must imagine Nineveh not as silent mounds, but as a living, breathing metropolis. the jewel of the Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful cities the world had yet seen. Nineveh's transformation into a great imperial capital began in earnest under King Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BC. Sennacherib was a builder on a grand scale, a king who wanted his capital to reflect the might and glory of his empire. He expanded the city massively, enclosing it within walls that he himself boasted measured 12 miles for the inner circuit and 50 miles including the outer fortifications. These were not simple walls, but massive constructions of mud, brick and stone, thick enough that chariots could ride along their tops, high enough to dwarf any enemy who approached. Within these walls, Sennacherib built his masterpiece, a palace he called the Palace Without a Rival. Imagine this building slowly, carefully. Picture a structure covering several acres, raised on an artificial platform that lifted it above the rest of the city. The walls were not bare mud brick, but faced with carved limestone slabs, each one covered with detailed reliefs showing the king's victories, his building projects, his hunting exploits, his receiving of tribute from conquered peoples. The entrance was flanked by massive protective spirits called lamassu, enormous sculptures combining a human head, the body of a bull or lion, and eagle's wings. These creatures stood perhaps 15 feet tall, carved from single blocks of stone that had been transported to Nineveh from quarries miles away. Each one weighed many tons. Their faces were serene but powerful, their beards carefully curled in the Assyrian fashion, their wings detailed feather by feather. They were meant to inspire awe, and they did. Inside the palace, room after room opened into further rooms, each one decorated, each one designed to display the power and culture of Assyria. The throne room was vast, its walls showing in endless detail the siege and conquest of the Judean city of Lachish, with hundreds of figures carved in limestone, soldiers advancing, defenders on walls, families being led away into exile, tribute being presented to the seated king. The detail was extraordinary. You could see the individual scales on armor, the fingers gripping weapons, the expressions on faces. Sennacherib also transformed the city's water supply, building a sophisticated system of canals and aqueducts that brought water from sources in the mountains many miles away. He created gardens, including what may have been the famous hanging gardens, often attributed to Babylon. These gardens were watered by his aqueduct system and featured plants and trees from across the empire, arranged in terraces that seemed to float above the earth. When Sennacherib died, murdered by his own sons in a palace coup, his youngest son, Esarhaddon, eventually secured the throne, and after Esarhaddon came Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to around 631 BC. Ashurbanipal continued the building program, constructing his own grand palace in the north of the city. But Ashurbanipal's greatest achievement was not architectural, but intellectual. He created a vast library, gathering tablets from across the empire, copying and preserving the literature, science, religion, and history of Mesopotamia. In Ashurbanipal's library, archaeologists would eventually find over 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, including the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest written stories. Scribes sat in rooms of the palace, carefully copying texts in cuneiform script, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The library was a treasure house of human thought and achievement. The city itself was vibrant with life. Streets wound between buildings of mud brick. Merchants sold goods in marketplaces, their voices calling out prices and wares. The smell of bread baking, of meat cooking, of animals in their pens mixed with the dust that rose from the streets. Temples rose at key points throughout the city, dedicated to the great gods of Mesopotamia: Ishtar, goddess of love and war; Nabu, god of writing and wisdom; Shamash, god of the sun and justice; Nagal, god of war and plague. In these temples, priests performed daily rituals, offering food and drink to the statues of the gods, burning incense, chanting prayers. The statues themselves were works of art, carved and decorated, dressed in special garments, their eyes inlaid with precious stones so they seemed to gaze out at their worshippers with living awareness. The population of Nineveh at its height may have reached 100,000 people or more, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. This was a cosmopolitan place, where Assyrians lived alongside people from conquered territories, where languages mingled in the streets, where merchants came from distant lands bringing exotic goods: ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, horses from the steppes to the north. But this great city, this center of power and culture, was not eternal. The very empire that had made Nineveh great was overstretched, its military constantly campaigning to hold territories that wanted freedom, its economy strained by the cost of endless warfare, its political system weakened by palace intrigues and succession disputes. By the later years of Ashurbanipal's reign, enemies were gathering. The Babylonians to the south, long subordinate to Assyria, were seeking independence under their new king, Nabopolassar. The Medes, a people from the Iranian plateau to the east, were organizing themselves into a formidable military power under their king, Cyaxares. The Scythians, nomadic warriors from the north, were raiding Assyrian territories. The empire was surrounded, and it was weakening. When Ashurbanipal died around 631 BC, the empire quickly fragmented. Succession disputes weakened the throne. Provinces rebelled. The army, stretched too thin across too many frontiers, could not respond effectively to every threat, and the enemies of Assyria, sensing weakness, began to coordinate their attacks. This was the situation as the 7th century BC drew toward its close. A great city, filled with palaces and temples, libraries and treasures, protected by massive walls and a fearsome reputation, but vulnerable as never before, its empire crumbling, its enemies advancing. Nineveh stood in its glory, not knowing that its time was running out, that within a few short years, all its grandeur would be reduced to ash and rubble, and that it would never rise again. Long before modern archaeologists began digging in the mounds of Nineveh, the city's destruction was recorded in texts. These ancient documents, written by different peoples in different languages for different purposes, all tell the same basic story. Nineveh fell, catastrophically and completely, in 612 BC. Let us examine these texts slowly, carefully, and see how their testimony aligns with the physical evidence we will explore in later sections. The most important historical document is the Babylonian Chronicle, specifically the tablet catalogued as Clay Tablet 21901, now housed in the British Museum in London. This tablet is part of a series of chronicles that recorded major events in Mesopotamian history, year by year, written in cuneiform script on clay in the Akkadian language. The chronicles were not propaganda or poetry, but relatively straightforward historical records kept for administrative purposes. The tablet that records the fall of Nineveh is damaged in places, with some portions of text missing, but what remains is clear enough. It describes the events of the 14th year of the reign of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, which corresponds to 612 BC by our modern calendar. The Chronicle names the attackers: the army of Babylon under Nabopolassar, and the army of the Medes under their king Cyaxares. These two forces, once enemies of each other, had formed an alliance against their common enemy, Assyria. The Chronicle describes a siege. It tells us that the attackers advanced on Nineveh and besieged it for 3 months, from the month of Sivan to the month of Ab, which in our modern calendar would be roughly from June to August. 3 months of siege warfare, 3 months of armies surrounding the walls, cutting off supplies, launching attacks, building siege equipment, undermining defenses. And then the city fell. The Chronicle's language is stark and final. They carried off the vast booty of the city and the temple and turned the city into a ruin heap. These words, pressed into clay 2,600 years ago, describe in the most direct terms what happened. The city was looted. The temples were plundered. And what remained was not a functioning city, but a ruin heap, a tell, a mound of destruction. The Chronicle also mentions that the attackers pursued the remnants of the Assyrian army and royal family as they fled westward, and that the last Assyrian king, whose name the damaged tablet may have recorded as Sin-shar-ishkun, likely died in the final assault on the city or in its immediate aftermath. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, effectively ended with the fall of its capital. But the Babylonian Chronicle is not the only ancient text that records Nineveh's destruction. The Hebrew Bible contains 2 prophetic books that focus specifically on Nineveh: the Book of Nahum and references in the Book of Zephaniah. These are religious texts, not historical chronicles, but they contain details that are remarkably consistent with what archaeology has revealed. The Book of Nahum is entirely devoted to prophesying the fall of Nineveh. It was likely written shortly before the city's actual destruction, when the weakening of Assyria was becoming apparent, but before the final catastrophe had occurred. The prophet's language is vivid and violent, celebrating the coming downfall of the city that had caused so much suffering to Israel and Judah. Nahum describes the attack in poetic but specific terms. He speaks of the gates of the rivers being opened, suggesting flooding as part of the siege tactics. He describes fire consuming the city. The fire devours the bars of your gates. He speaks of defenders manning the walls, of the palace dissolving, of treasures being plundered. These are not vague generalities, but specific details of siege warfare and urban destruction. What makes Nahum's prophecy particularly interesting to archaeologists is how well its details match the physical evidence. The reference to flooding aligns with archaeological findings of water-laid silt in lower areas of the city. The emphasis on fire aligns with the thick ash layers and calcined stone found throughout the site. The mention of plunder aligns with the absence of precious materials from the destruction layer. The text, whether genuinely predictive or written shortly after the events it describes, captures the reality of what happened to Nineveh. Zephaniah also mentions Nineveh's coming destruction, predicting that the great city will become a desolation, dry as a desert, home to flocks and desert animals, its carved capitals lying broken. Again, the prophecy proved accurate. Nineveh did become desolate, and it was never rebuilt as a major urban center. Later, Greek historians recorded traditions about Nineveh's fall, though writing centuries after the event. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, preserved a tradition that the city fell when the Tigris River flooded and breached the city walls. According to this account, an ancient prophecy had said that Nineveh would not fall until the river became its enemy. When floods undermined a section of the walls during the siege, the defenders lost hope and the city was taken. Whether this specific detail is accurate or legendary is debatable, but it reflects a persistent tradition that water played a role in the city's fall, consistent with both Nahum's prophecy and the archaeological evidence of flooding. The Greek sources also preserve the memory that Nineveh's last king died in the flames of his own palace, choosing to burn himself and his treasures rather than surrender, though this may be more legend than fact. What is significant about these various textual sources is their agreement on the essential facts. Nineveh was besieged by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The siege lasted some months. The city fell through a combination of assault and possibly flooding. The city was thoroughly looted and burned, and it was never restored as a major center. Different sources, written by different peoples in different languages for different purposes, all tell the same basic story. When we combine these texts with the archaeological evidence, we get a remarkably complete picture. The texts tell us who attacked Nineveh, when it happened, and roughly how it happened. The archaeology shows us the physical reality of that destruction, preserved in layers of ash and broken stone and buried artifacts. Text and archaeology together create a convergence of evidence that makes the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BC one of the most thoroughly documented events of ancient history. But there is one more category of textual evidence that deserves mention: the tablets found in the ruins of Nineveh itself, particularly those from Ashurbanipal's Great Library. When the palace burned, the fire baked thousands of clay tablets, hardening them and ironically preserving them for future discovery. These tablets include administrative records, letters, literary works, religious texts, scientific treatises, and historical documents. Some of these tablets are dated to the last years of the Assyrian Empire. Some are administrative records that simply stop mid-sentence or mid-account, frozen at the moment when normal governmental functions ceased. These tablets are dated to the reign of the last kings. And then there is silence, there is fire, there is ash. The written record simply ends, abruptly and completely, exactly when the Babylonian Chronicle tells us the city fell. Imagine the scribes who wrote these tablets. Imagine them sitting in palace rooms, reed styluses in hand, pressing cuneiform signs into soft clay, recording grain deliveries, tax receipts, legal transactions, royal correspondence. Imagine them working right up until the end, perhaps hearing the sounds of battle growing closer, perhaps seeing smoke rising from other parts of the city, but continuing to work because this was their duty, their training, their purpose. And then the enemy broke through, and the palace was looted, and fire consumed everything, and the tablets the scribes had written were buried in collapse and ash, not to be read again for 2,500 years. The textual evidence is clear, but texts alone might be dismissed or debated. What makes the case for Nineveh's destruction truly overwhelming is how perfectly the written records align with what archaeologists have found in the earth itself. Words on clay and stone in the ground tell the same story. And it is to that physical evidence that we now turn, beginning with the city's first line of defense, its massive walls and fortified gates. Imagine walls of mud brick, baked hard by the sun, rising 40 or 50 feet into the air, thick as a house is wide. Imagine these walls stretching for miles, encircling an area of some 1,800 acres, creating a defended perimeter behind which 100,000 people lived and worked. Imagine guard towers spaced along the walls, each one providing a vantage point from which soldiers could watch for approaching enemies. Imagine gates, massive gateways that channeled traffic into and out of the city, each gate a fortress in itself. These were the fortifications of Nineveh, and they were formidable. Sennacherib himself boasted of them in his inscriptions, describing how he had rebuilt and expanded the city walls, making them higher and thicker, adding towers, strengthening gates. The walls were not just functional, they were symbols of the city's power, visible from miles away, intimidating to any enemy who might consider attack. The city had multiple gates, each one named for a god or a function. There was the Shamash Gate, named for the sun god, the Nergal Gate, named for the god of war, the Chorsabad Gate, the Adad Gate, the Halsey Gate, and others. 15 or 18 gates in all, according to various reconstructions, each one providing access to the city, while also serving as a potential choke point against invaders. These gates were not simple openings in the wall. They were complex architectural structures, passages that went through the thickness of the wall, often with multiple doors, guard rooms on either side, and sometimes with chambers above where archers could fire down on anyone trying to force entry. The gates were decorated as well, often with the protective lamassu figures, and with glazed bricks in bright colors, displaying the power and artistry of the Assyrian kingdom. When archaeologists excavated Nineveh, starting in the 19th century and continuing with various expeditions through the 20th and into the 21st, they found these walls and gates, and they found them showing clear evidence of violent destruction. Let us start with the walls themselves. In numerous places along the circuit of walls, archaeologists found sections that had been deliberately breached. These were not areas where the wall had gradually eroded over time, but places where it had been forcibly broken through. The bricks showed signs of having been attacked, broken apart, pushed inward. In some areas, the wall had partially collapsed, leaving rubble that still lay where it fell 26 centuries ago. Evidence also emerged of undermining. Ancient siege warfare often involved sapping, digging tunnels under enemy walls to weaken their foundations. The attacking army would dig a tunnel, shore it up with wooden beams, then set fire to the beams so that the tunnel collapsed, bringing down the wall above it. While direct evidence of sap tunnels can be difficult to identify after so much time, archaeologists have suggested that some of the wall collapses at Nineveh show patterns consistent with this type of undermining. But perhaps the most dramatic evidence comes from the gates, where the evidence of destruction is unmistakable. Take the Khorsabad Gate as an example. When this gate was excavated, archaeologists found thick layers of ash, the clear residue of intense fire. They found bricks that had been exposed to such extreme heat that they had vitrified, partially melted and fused together, something that happens only at very high temperatures sustained for a significant time. This was not a small fire or an accidental burning. This was a conflagration, a massive blaze that raged for hours or perhaps days. The Shamash Gate tells a similar story. The gateway structure was found heavily damaged, its bricks shattered and burned, its protective sculptures damaged or destroyed. The passage through the gate was choked with debris from the collapse of upper structures and from the burning of wooden gates and roof beams. Scattered throughout these gateway excavations were the implements of war: arrowheads made of iron and bronze, sling stones of shaped stone and clay, spear points, bits of armor, and shield fittings. These were concentrated at the gates and at sections of wall that showed signs of assault, exactly where we would expect to find them if the city had been attacked and defended vigorously. The arrowheads are particularly telling. Archaeologists who studied them identified different types. Some were clearly Assyrian in manufacture, the kind used by the defenders, but others were of types associated with Babylonian and Median forces, the attackers named in the Babylonian Chronicle. These arrows had been fired at the gates and walls, and many of them were still there, buried in debris, silent witnesses to the battle that had raged around them. But the most poignant finds at the gates and walls were human remains. Skeletons were discovered in the debris, bodies that had never been properly buried, that had simply been left where they fell, and then covered by collapsing structures. These were the casualties of the battle, both attackers and defenders, killed in the fighting and never recovered for burial. Analysis of some of these skeletal remains showed trauma consistent with violent death in warfare. Bones bore cut marks from bladed weapons. Some skulls showed fracture patterns consistent with blunt force trauma from clubs or maces or falling stones. Some skeletons had arrowheads still embedded in bone, the final wound that killed them preserved for millennia. These were real people. These skeletons. They had names that are now forgotten. They had families, hopes, fears. On one side were Assyrian soldiers, manning the defenses of their city, perhaps native-born men of Nineveh, or perhaps troops from other parts of the empire, brought in to strengthen the garrison during the siege. They stood on the walls, fired arrows at the enemy, threw stones, poured boiling oil or water, fought desperately to hold the gates against the battering rams and storming parties. On the other side were Babylonian and Median soldiers, far from their homes, part of a great coalition army that had marched to destroy the empire that had dominated the region for so long. They dug siege works, built ramps, fired countless arrows at the defenders, rushed forward in assault after assault, testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses, losing comrades to the defenders' weapons but pressing on. For 3 months, this struggle continued, according to the Babylonian Chronicle. Imagine 3 months of this: the heat of a Mesopotamian summer, the dust, the thirst, the fear, the exhaustion. The defenders on short rations as supplies dwindled, knowing that no relief force was coming to save them, that they stood alone. The attackers suffering from disease and injury, and the constant danger of sorties by the defenders, but sustained by the hope of victory and plunder. And then, finally, the walls were breached. Perhaps it was undermining that brought down a section. Perhaps it was repeated assaults with battering rams that finally shattered a gate. Perhaps it was flooding that weakened foundations. Or perhaps it was a combination of all these things, the defenses failing at multiple points until the defenders could no longer hold. The archaeological evidence shows us the result. Gates burned to destruction, walls breached and collapsed, weapons scattered everywhere, bodies left where they fell. The fortifications of Nineveh, Those massive walls that had protected the city for decades, that had seemed so imposing and permanent, failed. The enemy was inside the city, and what had been a siege became a sack, became a massacre, became a looting, became a burning, became a destruction so complete that the city would never recover. The walls still stand in places, reduced and eroded, but still traceable across the landscape. You can still walk portions of the ancient circuit, seeing where the line of the wall ran, imagining it as it once was, high and imposing. But you can also see the breaks, the places where the destruction is still visible after all these centuries, where the stones lie tumbled and broken, just as they fell when Nineveh fell. Once the walls were breached, once the attackers poured into the city through broken gates and collapsed sections of fortification, the focus of destruction shifted to the heart of Nineveh's power, the royal palaces. These were not just residences but symbols, monumental statements of Assyrian imperial authority, repositories of wealth and art, and administrative records. Their destruction was both practical looting and symbolic erasure, the physical annihilation of Assyrian power. Let us begin with Sennacherib's palace without a rival, the southwest palace on the mound of Kuyunjik. This was the building that Sennacherib had devoted years to constructing and decorating, the centerpiece of his renovated capital. When Austin Henry Layard and subsequent archaeologists excavated this palace, they found a structure that had been devastated by fire. The throne room, that grand space where the king had received ambassadors and displayed his might, bore unmistakable marks of intense burning. The walls had been faced with limestone slabs carved in relief, showing in endless detail the king's conquests, particularly the siege of Lachish. These reliefs, many of which now reside in museums around the world, were found damaged by heat and fire. Limestone is a sedimentary rock made primarily of calcium carbonate. When limestone is exposed to extreme heat, temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius, about 1470 degrees Fahrenheit, a chemical change occurs. The heat drives off carbon dioxide, and the calcium carbonate turns into calcium oxide, commonly called quicklime. This process is called calcination, and it transforms the stone from hard limestone into crumbly white powder, or severely weakened cracked stone. In the throne room and other chambers of Sennacherib's palace, archaeologists found limestone slabs that had been calcined. They were cracked, crumbled, turned partially to powder. This tells us that the fire that swept through this palace was not just hot, but extraordinarily hot, and that it burned for a long time. A quick fire, even a large one, would not have generated enough sustained heat to calcine limestone, but a fire fed by wooden roof beams, wooden furniture, wooden doors, tapestries, grain stores, oil jars, all the combustible materials that filled an Assyrian palace, could and did generate such heat. Imagine the scene slowly. Picture the attackers breaking into the palace complex. Picture them moving through the rooms, searching for valuables, smashing anything that showed the king's power, defacing images of Assyrian gods and kings. Picture them gathering combustible materials, piling them in room after room, and then picture the flames beginning, spreading from room to room, climbing walls, consuming roof beams, until those massive timbers, some of them cedars, brought from Lebanon at great expense, began to crack and groan and finally collapse, sending up showers of sparks, creating an inferno that reached temperatures high enough to change the very chemistry of stone. The fire would have been visible for miles, a column of smoke rising into the sky, announcing to everyone in the region that Nineveh was burning, that the unthinkable was happening, that the greatest city in the world was being destroyed. Moving north across the mound, we come to Ashurbanipal's North Palace, the structure built by Sennacherib's grandson to house himself and his great library. This palace was, if anything, even more richly decorated than Sennacherib's. Its walls featured some of the finest artistic achievements of Assyrian sculpture, including the famous lion hunt scenes that show the king in his chariot pursuing lions, the muscular power of the animals, rendered with extraordinary realism, every detail of their anatomy captured in stone. When archaeologists excavated the North Palace, they found these magnificent reliefs, broken and buried in collapse. The palace had suffered the same fate as the Southwest Palace: systematic looting, followed by burning. The reliefs had been on the walls when the roof timbers burned through and collapsed, bringing down tons of mud brick from the upper walls and roof. Many of the carved slabs were found face down in the rubble, broken into pieces by the weight of the collapse. But here, the destruction preserved as much as it destroyed. When the palace burned and collapsed, the debris buried and sealed the famous library of Ashurbanipal. Thousands of clay tablets were caught in the destruction, and while many were broken, they were also baked hard by the fire, turning them from fragile, unfired clay into durable terracotta. This accidental firing preserved the texts for later discovery, an irony of archaeology. The fire that destroyed the library also saved it. The systematic looting of the palaces is evident in what was found, and more tellingly, in what was not found. The palaces had been filled with valuable objects: furniture inlaid with ivory, vessels of gold and silver, jewelry, fine textiles, weapons decorated with precious metals, statues of bronze and precious stone. Almost none of this was found in the destruction layers. What the archaeologists did find were materials with no resale value: the broken limestone reliefs, too heavy to carry away, shattered pottery, charred wooden beams, everyday tools and implements. They found bronze and iron objects, metals that were common enough to not be worth the trouble of looting, but gold and silver and gems were almost entirely absent. This tells us that the looting was thorough and efficient, that the attackers methodically stripped the palaces of everything valuable before they burned them. But the looters did more than just take valuables. They engaged in what we might call iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of images and symbols of power. The great Lamassu figures, those protective spirits that flanked doorways, were systematically defaced. Their eyes were gouged out with chisels. Their noses were broken off. Their carefully carved beards were smashed. Why would attackers spend time and effort doing this? These statues weighed many tons. They could not be moved or stolen, but they could be humiliated, defeated, symbolically destroyed. In the religious and cultural context of the ancient Near East, these statues were not just decorations. They were believed to have protective power, to embody the might of the gods who guarded Assyria. By destroying them, the attackers were not just looting a city. They were defeating its divine protectors, proving that the gods of Assyria were powerless to save their city. The same pattern appears throughout the palace complex. Royal statues were toppled and smashed. Inscriptions naming Assyrian kings were chiseled off walls. Any symbol of Assyrian royal power was targeted for destruction. This was not random vandalism, but systematic erasure, an attempt to destroy not just the physical city, but its memory, its authority, its claim to power. In some rooms of the palaces, archaeologists found hoards of valuables that had been hastily buried by the inhabitants. Small collections of jewelry, cylinder seals, precious tablets were found buried in corners or under floors, hidden by people who hoped to survive the sack and return to reclaim their property. The fact that these hoards remained undiscovered until modern excavation tells us that those who buried them never returned. They died in the destruction or fled and could never come back, or simply lost track of where they had hidden their treasures in the chaos. The bit, Hilani, a type of entrance structure with columns that supported a portico, common in Assyrian architecture and featured in the palaces of Nineveh, was reduced to rubble. Archaeologists found the column bases, heavy stones that had supported wooden columns, lying in place, but the columns themselves were gone, burned to ash, and the structures they had supported had collapsed into heaps of broken brick. Room by room, the excavations revealed the same story. Here was a chamber that had once been richly decorated, its walls carved and painted, its floor paved with baked brick, its ceiling supported by cedar beams. And here was what remained: a layer of ash several feet deep, chunks of calcined limestone, fragments of charred wood, bits of vitrified brick, and beneath it all, the floor, intact but covered with the debris of destruction. Moving through the evidence slowly, patiently, we can reconstruct what happened. First came the looting, professional and thorough, stripping away everything of value that could be carried. Then came the iconoclasm, the deliberate defacing and destroying of royal and divine images. And finally came the fire, massive and consuming, burning hot enough and long enough to calcine limestone, to vitrify brick, to reduce roof beams to ash, to bring down the entire upper structure in a collapse of broken mud brick. When it was over, the palaces that had taken decades to build, that had been filled with the wealth of an empire, that had housed kings and their courts, that had been the administrative centers of Assyrian power, were nothing but burned-out shells, collapsed heaps of rubble that would gradually be covered by wind-blown soil and become parts of the tells that farmers would graze their sheep on 2.5 millennia later. The destruction was so complete that many of the finest artifacts from Nineveh, the reliefs now in the British Museum, the Louvre, museums in Berlin and Chicago and elsewhere, were not recovered from mere intact contexts, but had to be pieced together from fragments found in the rubble, broken by the collapse, preserved only because they were too heavy to remove entirely and too broken to be worth the effort. Beyond the royal palaces, Nineveh was filled with temples, sacred spaces dedicated to the gods of Mesopotamia. These temples were not peripheral to the city's life, but central to it, serving as centers of worship, repositories of wealth, and symbols of divine protection. The destruction of Nineveh included the destruction of these sacred spaces, and the archaeological evidence of this religious catastrophe is particularly revealing. The Temple of Nabu, god of writing and wisdom, was one of the most important religious structures in Nineveh. Nabu was the divine patron of scribes, the keeper of the tablets of destiny, the god who recorded the fates of all things. His temple in Nineveh was both a place of worship and, appropriately, a repository of written knowledge, housing part of the royal library and archival tablets. When archaeologists excavated the Temple of Nabu, they found it destroyed in the same manner as the palaces, but with a particular irony. The temple had burned, and the fire had consumed its wooden elements and baked its clay tablets. But while the fire destroyed the temple structure, it also preserved the library. The tablets, which had been made of unfired clay, soft enough that a strong rainstorm could dissolve them, were baked hard by the fire, transformed into durable ceramic objects that could survive burial for millennia. Imagine the scene: flames consuming the temple, scribes fleeing or dying, sacred objects being looted or smashed. And amid all this destruction, tablets by the hundreds or thousands being fired like pottery in a kiln, their cuneiform texts being permanently preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed everything else. When these tablets were eventually discovered and read, they provided scholars with invaluable information about Assyrian culture, literature, religion, and administration, all preserved by accident, saved by destruction. The Ishtar temple tells a similar but distinct story. Ishtar was the great goddess of love and war, one of the most important deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, fierce and passionate, capable of both nurturing and destroying. Her temple in Nineveh was a major cult center, a place where worshippers came to seek her favor, where priests performed elaborate rituals, where valuable offerings accumulated. Excavations at the Ishtar temple revealed clear destruction layers, thick deposits of ash, and burned material overlaying the latest Assyrian occupation levels. The stratigraphy was unambiguous. Here was evidence of the temple functioning normally, and then suddenly evidence of catastrophic burning and abandonment, with no significant rebuilding afterward. But the most telling evidence from the temples came from the treatment of cult statues in Neo-Mesopotamian religion. The statues of gods were not merely representations or symbols. They were understood to be inhabited by the gods themselves, to be the physical presence of divinity on earth. These statues were cared for with elaborate rituals. They were fed, clothed, washed, given offerings, addressed in prayers and hymns. To harm a cult statue was not vandalism, but an attack on the god itself. The cult statues from Nineveh's temples were found toppled and smashed. Some had been deliberately broken into pieces. Others had been thrown down from their pedestals and left lying in the debris. This was ritual warfare, religious conquest. By destroying the statues of Assyrian gods, the attackers were symbolically defeating those gods, proving them powerless to protect their city, demonstrating that the gods of Babylon and Media were more powerful than the gods of Assyria. This practice had deep roots in ancient Near Eastern warfare. When one city conquered another, the victors often carried away the defeated city's god statues as captives, installing them in their own temples in subordinate positions, or destroying them to show divine defeat. The biblical accounts of various Israelite and Judean conflicts with neighboring peoples frequently mention the capture or destruction of god statues as key elements of victory or defeat. The destruction of Nineveh's temples had practical as well as symbolic dimensions. Temples were wealthy institutions, repositories of accumulated offerings, gold and silver vessels, precious stones, fine textiles, stores of grain and oil. All of this was plundered systematically. The temples were treasure houses, and they were thoroughly robbed. But the destruction went beyond mere theft. The temple structures themselves were burned, their sanctuaries violated, their sacred spaces profaned. In the ancient world, temples were supposed to be inviolable. protected by divine power and human taboo. To deliberately burn and destroy temples was to commit sacrilege, and the fact that the attackers did this without suffering divine punishment was, in the theology of the time, proof that the gods had abandoned Assyria, that divine favor had shifted to Babylon and Media. The archaeological evidence shows us rooms that had been shrine chambers, their walls once decorated with religious imagery, their floors worn smooth by the feet of generations of priests and worshippers. We see the evidence of ritual furniture, the bases where incense altars had stood, the platforms where cult statues had been placed, all found amid ash and collapse. We find scattered fragments of religious paraphernalia, pieces of ritual vessels, cylinder seals showing religious scenes, fragments of terracotta plaques depicting gods and goddesses, all broken and discarded in the destruction debris. These were sacred objects, treated with reverence in normal times. But in the chaos of the sack, they were just more debris to be trampled underfoot. The temples of Nineveh had served the city for generations. Morning and evening, priests had performed the required rituals. On feast days, processions had wound through the streets, carrying divine images, while crowds of worshippers chanted hymns. People had come to these temples in times of joy and sorrow, seeking divine blessing for marriages and births, divine comfort in sickness and death, divine favor for business ventures and political undertakings. And then, in 612 BC, in a matter of days, or perhaps just hours, all of that ended. The temples were violated, looted, and burned. The cult statues were smashed or carried away. The priests were killed or fled. The sacred spaces became ruins. And in the theology of the time, this could mean only one thing. The gods had abandoned Nineveh, had withdrawn their protection, had allowed the city to fall as divine punishment for Assyrian sins. Later texts, including the Cyrus Cylinder, written by the Persian king Cyrus the Great after he conquered Babylon decades later, would interpret the fall of Assyria in exactly these terms. The gods had become angry with Assyrian tyranny and had therefore allowed the empire to be destroyed. Whether or not one accepts this theological interpretation, the archaeological fact remains. The temples of Nineveh were systematically destroyed, their sanctuaries burned, their sacred objects smashed or stolen, their functions ceased entirely, never to resume. The silence that followed the destruction was a religious silence as well as a physical one. No more sacrifices were offered on these altars. No more prayers rose from these shrines. No more festivals were celebrated in these sacred precincts. The gods, if they listened at all, heard only silence from the ruins of Nineveh, a silence that would last until archaeologists began to dig, bringing to light the evidence of destruction, but not bringing back the life, the worship, the sacred activities that had once filled these spaces. If you were to dig down through the mounds of Nineveh today, carefully removing the soil layer by layer, recording what you found at each level, you would encounter a clear boundary in the earth, a distinct marker that separates the Assyrian city from everything that came after. This boundary is called the destruction layer, and it is one of the most important pieces of archaeological evidence for the fall of Nineveh. Let us examine it slowly, carefully, understanding what it tells us and how archaeologists read its testimony. Stratigraphy is the study of layers in the earth. The basic principle is simple. In undisturbed deposits, lower layers are older than higher layers because material accumulates over time, new layers forming on top of old ones. archaeologists excavate stratigraphically, removing one layer at a time, recording the contents and characteristics of each layer, building up a sequence that traces the history of a site from bottom to top, from oldest to most recent. At Nineveh, excavations across the site, in the palaces, in the temples, in residential areas, all revealed the same stratigraphic sequence in the levels dating to the late 7th century BC. At the bottom of this sequence were the living remains of the Assyrian city, floors of buildings, foundation walls, pottery, tools, the everyday debris of urban life in a functioning metropolis. These layers showed normal patterns of occupation, gradual accumulation of material, periodic repairs and rebuilding, the expected mess and disorganization of a living city. And then, sharply defined above these occupation layers, came the destruction layer. This was not a gradual transition, but an abrupt boundary, a clear line in the earth that marked a catastrophic event. The destruction layer was thick, in some places several feet deep, and its composition was unmistakable. It's ash, charred material, burned brick, collapsed debris. The ash was not light and fluffy, like the ash from a campfire, but dense and compacted, the residue of massive fires that had burned with great intensity. Mixed with the ash were fragments of charred wood, the remains of roof beams, door frames, furniture, all reduced to carbonized fragments. There were pieces of burned brick, some of them vitrified, fused together by heat, their surfaces glossy and bubbly where the clay had begun to melt. The destruction layer contained burned foodstuffs, charred grain from storage jars, carbonized date seeds, remnants of oil that had burned in the fires. These organic materials, normally quick to decay, were preserved by carbonization, turned into stable carbon that could survive burial. Their presence throughout the destruction layer indicates that the fires consumed not just buildings, but also their contents, that storerooms and kitchens and pantries all burned along with the structures that housed them. Textiles, normally extremely perishable, left traces in the destruction layer in the form of carbonized fragments, or as impressions in ash. Fine linens, woolen garments, tapestries, all were consumed by fire, leaving only shadows of their former existence. The destruction layer also contained artifacts that showed signs of having been in the fires, pottery that had been fire-blackened or cracked by heat, metal objects that had been warped or partially melted, objects made of materials like ivory or bone that showed burning. What makes the destruction layer so significant as evidence is its uniformity across the site. This was not a localized fire in one building or one neighborhood. Excavations in different areas of Nineveh, the Southwest Palace, the North Palace, the Shamash Gate area, the Ishtar Temple, residential districts, all revealed the same thick destruction layer at the same stratigraphic level. This indicates a site-wide catastrophe, an event that affected the entire city at the same time. Equally significant is what lies below and above the destruction layer. Below it, as all mentioned, are the normal occupation layers of the Assyrian city, showing a wealthy, functioning urban center at the height of its power. The pottery is fine quality. The buildings are well constructed and maintained. There is evidence of trade and prosperity. The material culture is rich and varied. Above the destruction layer, the picture changes dramatically. In most areas, there is simply sterile soil, windblown sand and dust that accumulated over the ruins over centuries of abandonment. The site became Tell, a mound covered by the slow accumulation of natural sediments. In some areas, there is evidence of very limited, very poor quality post-Assyrian occupation. A few Persian period pottery fragments might be found, or some Hellenistic sherds, but these are sparse and crude compared to the Assyrian materials, and they do not indicate any significant rebuilding or reoccupation. What these scattered later materials suggest is that in the centuries after 612 BC, people occasionally camped in the ruins or built small temporary structures using stones scavenged from the collapsed buildings. But there was never any attempt to restore Nineveh as a functioning city. The destruction layer itself is sealed, meaning that it was not disturbed by later rebuilding. When a city is destroyed but then rebuilt, the destruction layer is typically cut through by new foundation trenches, mixed with new construction debris, disturbed and contaminated by the activities of the new inhabitants. But at Nineveh, the destruction layer remained intact, covered over by sterile soil or minimal later occupation debris, preserved exactly as it was left in 612 BC. This sealed destruction layer is like a time capsule. Everything in it dates to the moment of destruction or shortly before. The pottery types, the artifact styles, the types of objects found, all can be dated to the late 7th century BC, to the final years of the Assyrian Empire. And everything shows the same evidence of catastrophic burning. Archaeologists have found, within this destruction layer, objects that were clearly in use at the moment of destruction. Cooking pots still containing remnants of their last meal, now charred. Oil lamps knocked over, their oil feeding the fires. Tablets still lying where they fell when shelves collapsed. Tools dropped and never recovered. These are the frozen moments of catastrophe, the instant when normal life ceased and destruction took over. The calcined limestone that we discussed earlier is found throughout the destruction layer in the palace areas. Limestone slabs that had been carved into reliefs were cracked and crumbled by heat, in some cases reduced to white powder. This calcination requires sustained temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius. Such temperatures would not be reached in a normal building fire, but they could be reached when massive amounts of combustible material burned in an enclosed space, when roof timbers and furniture and stored goods all burned together, creating an inferno. The fire was not the only destructive force recorded in the destruction layer. There is also evidence of deliberate demolition. Walls were pushed over, their bricks collapsing in patterns that suggest they were deliberately toppled rather than simply gradually decaying. In some areas, archaeologists found evidence that walls had been undermined or had their foundations excavated. Classic siege warfare techniques designed to bring down fortifications. There is also evidence, in some lower-lying areas of the city, of water-laid silt within or directly above the destruction layer. This fine sediment was deposited by water, suggesting flooding. This aligns with the ancient accounts, both in Nahum's prophecy and in Greek sources, that flooding played a role in the fall of Nineveh. Whether the attackers deliberately diverted water from the Tigris or one of the canals that fed the city, or whether natural flooding occurred during the siege, water appears to have been one of the destructive forces that contributed to the city's fall. The destruction layer is not just evidence of fire and collapse, it is evidence of abandonment. After the catastrophe, there was no cleanup, no attempt to salvage materials, no effort to rebuild. The debris simply lay where it fell, covering the floors of buildings, filling the streets, burying everything. And then the wind began to blow dust over it, and rain washed soil over it, and vegetation grew and died and added its organic matter. And slowly, over centuries, the ruins were covered, becoming mounds, tells, hills in the landscape that preserve beneath them the evidence of catastrophe. When modern archaeologists excavate this destruction layer, they work carefully, photographing and recording everything, collecting samples for various types of analysis. They can date charcoal fragments using radiocarbon dating, confirming that the destruction occurred in the late 7th century BC. They can analyze the ash to determine what kinds of materials burned. They can study the patterns of collapse to understand how buildings fell. They can examine the artifacts to understand what life was like in Nineveh's final days. The destruction layer speaks with the authority of physical evidence. It cannot be explained away as propaganda or myth. It is simply there, in the earth, exactly where it should be if Nineveh fell catastrophically in 612 BC. It is uniform, sealed, filled with the unmistakable evidence of fire and collapse and abandonment. It separates a prosperous, powerful city from sterile desolation. It is, in its silent, patient way, one of the most eloquent testimonies to historical catastrophe that archaeology has ever found. The Babylonian Chronicle tells us that Nineveh was besieged for 3 months before it fell, from the month of Sivan to the month of Ab, roughly June to August in our calendar. 3 months may not sound like a long siege by ancient standards. Some sieges lasted years, but 3 months of siege warfare in the heat of a Mesopotamian summer, with armies of thousands surrounding the walls, would have been a period of intense suffering for defenders and attackers alike. Let us reconstruct this siege slowly, using the archaeological evidence and the historical records to understand what happened during those 3 months. The attacking forces would have arrived in early summer, armies of Babylonians under King Nabopolassar and Medes under King Cyaxares, possibly with contingents from other groups such as Scythians or rebellious former Assyrian subjects. The exact size of this force is not recorded, but to successfully besiege a city of Nineveh's size and strength, it would have needed to be substantial, probably tens of thousands of soldiers at minimum. The first task of any besieging army is to surround the city and cut off its communications and supplies. Nineveh's walls enclosed a large area, about 1,800 acres. So completely surrounding it would have required the attackers to spread their forces thin, establishing camps and fortified positions at intervals around the perimeter. Archaeological surveys around Nineveh have identified possible locations of these besiegers' camps, though the evidence is less clear than the evidence from within the city itself. One of the most tangible pieces of siege evidence is the massive earthen ramp discovered at the Nergal Gate area. Siege ramps were standard equipment in ancient Near Eastern warfare. The attacking army would build a large ramp of earth and stone leading up to the city wall, allowing them to bring siege engines, battering rams, and assault troops up to the level of the wall's top. Building such a ramp was an enormous undertaking, requiring thousands of workers to move tons of earth and stone, piling it higher and higher, compacting it to bear the weight of siege equipment and soldiers. The ramp had to be built while the defenders rained down arrows, stones, boiling oil, anything they could throw to disrupt the work. Men died building these ramps, killed by defensive fire. But the work continued until the ramp reached the required height. The ramp at Nineveh's Nergal Gate was identified by archaeologists as a large accumulation of earth and rubble in a characteristic shape, rising toward the city wall. This was not a natural formation, but a constructed siege work, evidence of the methodical engineering that went into the attack on Nineveh. Once a ramp was built, the attackers could bring up battering rams, large wooden structures with metal-tipped rams that would be repeatedly swung against the wall or gate to break through. The rams were often housed in wooden towers that protected the operators from defensive fire. These ram towers would be rolled up the siege ramp and positioned against the wall, and the rhythmic battering would begin, blow after blow against stone and brick, hour after hour, day after day if necessary, until something gave way. The defenders would try to destroy the siege equipment, dropping heavy stones on it, shooting fire arrows to set it ablaze, sending out sorties to attack it directly. But if the attackers protected their equipment well and maintained their assault, eventually the wall or gate would crack, would be weakened, would begin to fail. Simultaneously with the building of siege ramps, attackers often employed sapping, the digging of tunnels under enemy walls. This was dangerous, difficult work. Sappers would dig a tunnel from a covered position, shore it up with wooden beams to prevent collapse, and extend it under the wall's foundation. When the tunnel reached the right position, the wooden supports would be set on fire, the tunnel would collapse, and ideally, the wall above would come tumbling down. Evidence of sapping at Nineveh is more circumstantial than the evidence of the siege ramp, but some of the wall collapses show patterns that archaeologists have suggested could indicate undermining. The Babylonian Chronicle's mention of a 3-month siege suggests that the attackers were using methodical siege techniques rather than relying on a quick assault, and sapping was a standard part of the siege warfare toolkit in this period. The concentration of weaponry found at certain points along the walls and gates tells its own story. Archaeologists found large numbers of arrowheads, both iron and bronze, concentrated at places that showed signs of assault. The iron arrowheads were of types associated with Babylonian and Median forces. Iron metallurgy was more advanced in these regions at this time. The bronze arrowheads were more typically Assyrian. This tells us that intense exchanges of arrow fire occurred at these locations. Defenders on the walls shooting down at attackers below, attackers shooting up at defenders, volleys of arrows going back and forth, men falling wounded or dead on both sides, more men taking their places. This went on for hours at a time, perhaps for days. The constant danger of an arrow from an unseen archer, the need to stay behind cover, yet still be able to shoot back. Sling stones were also found in large numbers. Slings were simple weapons, but deadly in skilled hands, capable of hurling stones with enough force to kill or seriously injure. Both attackers and defenders would have used slings, and the stones, often specially shaped for maximum accuracy and impact, were found scattered through the destruction layers at the walls and gates. The skeletal evidence is particularly poignant. Bodies found in the debris of walls and gateways, never properly buried, tell us that the fighting was intense enough that the dead could not be recovered during the battle. Ancient armies tried to retrieve their dead when possible, for burial according to proper custom. But sometimes the fighting was too fierce, the tactical situation too unstable, and bodies were left where they fell. Analysis of some of these skeletons revealed the injuries that killed them: sharp force trauma from bladed weapons, swords, spears, daggers; blunt force trauma from clubs or maces or thrown stones or collapsing walls; embedded arrowheads, the points still lodged in bone where they struck; These injuries are consistent with close-quarters combat, the brutal hand-to-hand fighting that would have occurred when attackers breached the walls or forced open gates, and the defenders tried to push them back. The flood evidence adds another dimension to our reconstruction of the siege. In lower-lying areas of the city, archaeologists found deposits of water-laid silt within or directly above the destruction layer. This fine sediment is characteristic of flooding, of water that flowed through the area, carrying suspended particles that then settled out. Ancient sources, including Nahum's prophecy, and Greek historians like Diodorus Siculus, mention flooding as part of Nineveh's fall. The accounts speak of the Tigris River or the city's canals being used against it, water being diverted to undermine walls or flood the lower city. Whether this was deliberate engineering by the attackers or opportunistic use of seasonal flooding or some combination, water appears to have been one of the destructive forces involved in the siege. Imagine the psychological impact of a prolonged siege. For the defenders inside Nineveh, there was the daily grind of guard duty on the walls, the constant vigilance required to watch for enemy movements, the exhaustion of being always ready for an assault that could come at any moment. There was the diminishing food supply as stored grain was consumed, and no new supplies could come in. There was the uncertainty about whether relief forces would arrive, whether other Assyrian cities would send help, and as days became weeks and weeks became months, there was the growing realization that they stood alone, that no help was coming, that they would have to hold out on their own or perish. For the attackers surrounding the city, there was different but equally real suffering. Disease was a constant threat in military camps, especially in summer heat with inadequate sanitation. Supplies had to be brought from distant bases. There was the danger of sorties by the defenders, sudden attacks designed to disrupt siege works or destroy equipment. There was the frustration of long, hard work building siege equipment, the constant risk from defensive fire, the casualties from disease and combat. But the attackers had hope on their side, the hope of victory and plunder, the knowledge that the Assyrian Empire was collapsing elsewhere, that Nineveh stood increasingly isolated, and they had leadership, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares, experienced commanders who coordinated their forces and maintained the pressure on the defenders. As the siege progressed through June into July into August, the situation for the defenders became increasingly desperate. Food supplies would have been running low. The psychological toll of constant danger and isolation would have been severe. Perhaps there were political tensions within the city, debates about whether to surrender or fight to the end, accusations and recriminations among the leadership. And then, finally, the defenses failed. Whether it was the siege ramp and battering rams that broke through, or sapping that brought down a section of wall, or flooding that undermined foundations, or some combination of all these things, the attackers broke into the city. Once the walls were breached, once the enemy was inside the perimeter, the siege became a sack, became urban warfare of the most brutal kind, street by street, house by house, until organized resistance collapsed, and what remained was massacre, and looting and burning. The 3-month siege was over. Nineveh had fallen, and the destruction that followed would be so complete that the city would never recover. The destruction of Nineveh was not random chaos, but systematic erasure. The archaeological evidence makes clear that the attackers did not simply loot and burn, but deliberately targeted the symbols and structures of Assyrian power. seeking not just to defeat the city, but to erase its authority, to destroy its memory, to ensure that it could never rise again. Consider the treatment of royal statuary. Throughout the palaces and gates of Nineveh stood statues of Assyrian kings and protective spirits. The most impressive of these were the lamassu, those enormous guardian figures with human heads, animal bodies, and wings. These statues weighed many tons, carved from single blocks of stone, positioned at key entryways to ward off evil and proclaim the power of the king who had commissioned them. These statues could not be moved or stolen by the attackers. They were too large, too heavy, but they could be damaged. And damaged they were, deliberately and systematically. Archaeologists found lamassu with their eyes gouged out, holes chiseled into the carefully carved faces where the eyes had been. Noses were broken off. Beards, which were carved in elaborate curled patterns showing great artistic skill, were smashed. Inscriptions on the statues, naming the king who had made them and invoking divine protection, were chiseled away. This was not practical looting, but symbolic violence. The attackers spent time and effort defacing these statues, time that could have been spent gathering portable valuables. They did this because, in the cultural and religious context of the ancient Near East, these statues were not just art or decoration. They were embodiments of power, protective spirits that guarded the city and the king. To destroy them was to prove them powerless, to defeat them symbolically as the city was being defeated physically. The same pattern appears with other royal statuary. Statues of kings, which would have stood in palaces and temples and public spaces, were systematically toppled and smashed. These statues, carved in the likeness of Assyrian rulers, showing them in poses of authority and power, were deliberately destroyed. In some cases, archaeologists found the fragments still lying where the statues had been pushed over. The pieces never cleared away, left as evidence of humiliation and defeat. Inscriptions were another target. Assyrian kings were prolific builders and enthusiastic self-promoters, and they covered their monuments with inscriptions in cuneiform script, detailing their achievements, their building projects, their conquests, their piety toward the gods. These inscriptions were carved into stone walls, molded into clay bricks, incised into metal objects. The attackers targeted these inscriptions, chiseling them off walls, defacing them, removing the names of Assyrian kings wherever they could. This was cultural warfare, an attempt to destroy not just the physical city, but its historical record, to erase the memory of Assyrian power from the very stones. Why go to such effort? Because in the ancient world, memory was power. A king's legacy depended on his monuments surviving, on his name being remembered and spoken. To erase a king's name, to destroy his monuments, was to kill him a second time, to deprive him of the immortality that came from being remembered by future generations. The attackers of Nineveh understood this, and they acted accordingly, engaging in a systematic campaign of cultural destruction that went beyond mere conquest. The looting itself shows similar organization and thoroughness. As mentioned earlier, the palaces and temples had been filled with valuable objects, vessels of gold and silver, furniture inlaid with ivory and precious stones, fine textiles, weapons decorated with gold and jewels, statues of bronze and precious metals. Almost none of this was found in the destruction layers. What was found were objects with no resale value, broken pottery, charred wood, everyday tools of bronze or iron. The absence of valuable materials is almost total. Where we would expect to find gold and silver, if these were simply lost in the destruction, there is nothing. This indicates that the looting was methodical and efficient, that the attackers systematically stripped the city of everything worth taking before they burned it. Evidence of this organized plundering was found outside the city walls. Archaeological surveys identified areas that may have been the attackers' camps. And in some of these areas, archaeologists found evidence of metalworking, furnaces, slag, fragments of molds. These were recycling operations, places where looted metal objects were being melted down to produce ingots that could be transported more easily than bulky sculptures or furniture. Imagine the process. Soldiers bringing out cartloads of bronze statues, silver vessels, gold jewelry, all the precious metal objects they could strip from palaces and temples and wealthy homes. Craftsmen in the camp breaking these objects into pieces, feeding them into furnaces, melting them down, pouring the molten metal into molds to create standard ingots. The artistic and historical value of these objects meant nothing. What mattered was their weight in precious metal. This was plunder as an industry, organized and systematic. It required planning, logistics, specialized workers. It was not a chaotic free-for-all, but a coordinated operation, probably supervised by the kings or their appointed officials, with the plunder being carefully collected for division among the victors. The destruction of temples and palaces served multiple purposes. Obviously, it eliminated these buildings as centers of power and administration. An enemy cannot govern from a palace that has been reduced to rubble. Priests cannot perform rituals in a temple that has been burned and desecrated. But the destruction also sent a message, both to any surviving Assyrians and to the wider world. Assyria was finished, utterly defeated, its power broken beyond repair. Consider the Bit Hilani, the columned portico that was a distinctive feature of Assyrian palace architecture. This structure type was so associated with Assyrian power that its very form was symbolic. When the Bit Hilani structures at Nineveh were reduced to rubble, when the columns were burned and the porticos collapsed, the message was clear. Assyrian architectural power, Assyrian cultural prestige was destroyed. The archaeological evidence shows that this destruction was not the work of a moment, but of sustained effort. Buildings don't just collapse on their own, especially when they're built as solidly as Assyrian palaces. Walls had to be actively demolished, either by undermining them or by applying force to push them over. Valuable materials had to be stripped out before burning. The burning itself had to be organized, with combustible materials gathered and ignited systematically to ensure maximum destruction. And then, after the looting and burning, there was the decision not to rebuild. This was the final act of erasure. Cities throughout history have been conquered and burned, but often they are then rebuilt by the conquerors or by the survivors. Babylon was sacked multiple times, but always rebuilt. Jerusalem was destroyed and rebuilt, but Nineveh was not. The absence of any significant rebuilding at Nineveh is striking. The destruction layer is sealed by sterile soil or minimal later occupation, not by new construction. This suggests that there was a deliberate decision not to restore the city, to leave it in ruins as a warning and a memory of what happened to those who resisted Babylon and Media. In some areas, centuries later, poor settlers built small structures directly into the ruins, using fallen stones from palaces as building material, creating humble dwellings in the shadows of destruction. But these were squatter settlements, not rebuilding. They didn't restore Nineveh. They simply scavenged from its corpse. Even later, in Hellenistic times, people dug pits into the ruins to extract the carved limestone slabs, breaking them up to burn in kilns to produce lime for plaster. This was looting of a different kind, treating the ruins not as a city to be restored, but as a quarry, a source of raw materials. The fact that such looting was economically viable, that it was worth the effort to dig through ruins to extract stone, tells us how thoroughly the site had been abandoned. The systematic erasure of Nineveh extended even to its location in memory. By the Roman period, a few centuries after the destruction, the exact location of Nineveh had been forgotten. People knew from ancient texts that there had been a great city called Nineveh somewhere in the region, but they didn't know which tells marked its site. The city was lost, not just physically destroyed, but erased from geographical knowledge, reduced to legend and rumor. It was only in the 19th century that archaeologists, using ancient descriptions and their own investigations, identified the tells of Nebi Yunus and Kuyunjik as the site of Nineveh. The rediscovery was a scholarly achievement, piecing together clues from ancient texts and modern exploration. For 2.25 millennia, Nineveh had been effectively erased from human knowledge, its location lost, its ruins buried under tells that looked like dozens of other anonymous mounds in the Iraqi landscape. This complete erasure was the ultimate success of the systematic destruction carried out in 612 BC. The attackers didn't just defeat Nineveh, they obliterated it so thoroughly that even its location was forgotten. And this forgetting was possible only because the destruction had been so complete, because there had been no rebuilding to maintain continuity of occupation and memory, because the site had been truly and finally abandoned. After the fires were extinguished, after the attackers had carried away their plunder and departed, after the last survivors had fled or died, Nineveh lay silent. The great city, which had bustled with the activities of 100,000 people, which had echoed with the sounds of commerce and worship and government and everyday life, was quiet. The silence of abandonment settled over the ruins, and it would endure for more than 2,000 years. Imagine the scene in the months and years immediately after 612 BC. The palaces were blackened shells, their roofs collapsed, their walls cracked and calcined, their courtyards filled with rubble. The temples stood roofless and violated, their sanctuaries desecrated, their cult statues smashed or stolen. The massive walls, which had seemed so imposing and permanent, were breached and broken, gaps in their circuits like missing teeth. The gates were burned ruins, their protective lamassu defaced, their passages choked with debris. Within this landscape of destruction, there was no organized human presence. Perhaps a few survivors crept back, searching through the ruins for lost possessions or dead relatives. But there was no community, no attempt to resume normal life, the infrastructure that made urban living possible. The water supply, the food distribution system, the markets, the workshops, the government. All of this had been destroyed and was not being rebuilt. In the immediate aftermath, scavengers would have been active. Dogs and wild animals would have entered the ruins, feeding on the bodies of those who had died in the destruction. Birds would have nested in the broken walls. Plants would have begun to take root in the ash-covered soil. beginning the slow process of nature reclaiming what humans had abandoned. As months became years, the ruins would have begun to change. Mud brick, when exposed to rain and sun, begins to erode. Without the constant maintenance that occupied buildings receive, replastering walls, repairing roofs, clearing drains, the structures began to melt back toward the earth from which they had been made. Rain washed away surfaces, wind blew dust into every crevice, and gradually the sharp edges of walls softened. The distinct outlines of buildings blurred. Unlike cities like Babylon, which after various destructions were rebuilt and continued to function as major centers, Nineveh never recovered. Babylon, despite being conquered and sacked multiple times in its history, always bounced back because of its strategic location and economic importance. But Nineveh, once the heart of an empire that no longer existed, once a capital that had no kingdom to administer, had no reason to be rebuilt. The tells began to form. A tell is an archaeological term for a settlement mound, the accumulation of occupation debris that builds up over time as people live in one place for generations or centuries. But Nineveh's tells were formed not by continuous occupation, but by abandonment. The ruins collapsed inward, rubble piling up. Wind blew dust and sand over everything. Occasional rain washed soil from higher areas into lower ones. Vegetation grew and died, adding organic material. Very slowly, over decades and centuries, the ruins were buried under accumulating soil. At some point, the archaeological evidence suggests several centuries after the destruction, a few poor settlers established a small community in the ruins. They did not rebuild the palaces or restore the temples. Instead, they built simple houses directly into and on top of the collapsed buildings, using stones from the fallen walls, living in the shadow of a grandeur they probably didn't even understand. The pottery fragments from these later squatter settlements are crude and simple compared to the fine Assyrian wares found in the destruction layer. These were not wealthy people, not sophisticated urbanites, but probably farmers or herders who found the tells convenient locations for small settlements. They left little mark on the site. Their humble dwellings and few possessions barely registering in the archaeological record compared to the massive Assyrian remains beneath them. Even as these minimal settlements existed, the tells continued to grow, soil accumulating around and over the structures. The mounds rose slowly, but steadily, burying the Assyrian remains ever deeper, preserving them, but also hiding them, sealing them away from human knowledge. In the Hellenistic period, centuries after the fall, people who knew nothing of Nineveh's history dug pits into the tells, mining for building stone. They were after the carved limestone slabs that had once decorated palace walls. They would extract these slabs, break them into pieces, and burn them in kilns to produce quicklime for making plaster. This practice destroyed many reliefs completely, reducing priceless artistic and historical artifacts to industrial material. The fact that such quarrying was happening tells us two things. First, that the site was recognized as containing worked stone, which suggests some residual memory that something important had once been here. Second, that there was no reverence for these ruins, no sense of them as sacred or historically significant. They were just convenient sources of stone, to be mined like any quarry. By the time of the Roman Empire, even this residual knowledge had faded. Ancient texts mentioned Nineveh. The Bible, Greek historians, Mesopotamian chronicles preserved in other cities. But the actual location was uncertain. Travelers and historians of the Roman and later periods wrote about Nineveh as an ancient wonder, but they couldn't point to its remains with certainty. The tells became known by other names. One major mound was called Nebi Yunus, the hill of the prophet Jonah, based on the Islamic tradition that the prophet Jonah was buried there. Another was called Kuyunjik, an ancient name whose meaning was lost. Local people knew these as old mounds, probably ancient ruins of some kind, but not specifically as Nineveh. Farmers grazed sheep and goats on the tells. Children played on their slopes. The mounds were just part of the landscape, features of the local geography, unremarkable and familiar. Beneath the surface, sometimes just a few feet down, sometimes deeper, lay the remains of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. But the people who walked over these mounds daily had no idea. This state of affairs persisted through the early Islamic period, through the Middle Ages, into the early modern era. Nineveh remained lost, buried, forgotten. The silence that had fallen in 612 BC was unbroken by any significant reoccupation or rediscovery. It was only in the mid-19th century that European archaeologists, inspired by ancient texts and searching for physical evidence of biblical and classical accounts, began to investigate the tells of northern Iraq. Austin Henry Layard was the most famous of these early excavators, though others, including Paul Emile, Botta, and Hormuzd Rassam, also played crucial roles. When Layard's workmen began to dig into the mound of Kuyunjik, they quickly encountered astonishing finds. The carved reliefs from Assyrian palaces, the protective lamassu, cuneiform inscriptions, and eventually thousands of clay tablets. The rediscovery of Nineveh was a sensation in Europe, capturing public imagination and scholarly interest. Museums clamored for artifacts. Expeditions competed to uncover new areas of the site. But even as these excavations brought Nineveh back into human awareness, they also confirmed its destruction. Every major excavation revealed the same evidence: the thick destruction layer, the fire damage, the collapsed structures, the signs of looting and iconoclasm. The rediscovery of Nineveh was also the discovery of its violent end. The abandonment of Nineveh was so complete that even its location was lost for 22 centuries. This was not a city that gradually declined or was slowly depopulated. This was a catastrophic destruction, followed by total abandonment. The continuity of occupation and memory that keeps most ancient sites known and identified was completely broken at Nineveh. The tells stood silent through the rise and fall of the Persian Empire, the conquests of Alexander, the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Roman Empire, the Parthians, the Sasanians, the Islamic conquests, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mongol invasions, the Ottoman Empire. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, languages changed, religions transformed the region, but the tells of Nineveh stood unchanging, keeping their secrets, waiting for someone to remember what they contained. When that memory finally returned through the work of archaeologists, what emerged was the story we have been exploring. A story of systematic destruction, of fire and collapse, of looting and iconoclasm, of abandonment so complete that even the site's name was forgotten. The silence after Nineveh's fall was not just the silence of physical abandonment, but the silence of historical amnesia, a collective forgetting that erased the city, not just from the landscape, but from human knowledge itself. The destruction of Nineveh preserved as much as it destroyed. The fire that consumed the city also baked clay tablets hard, protecting them from decay. The collapse that buried artifacts also sealed them away from later disturbance. The abandonment that followed the destruction meant that the destruction layer remained intact, a time capsule from 612 BC. When archaeologists excavated Nineveh, the artifacts they found provided detailed, specific testimony about the city's final days and the catastrophe that ended them. Consider the clay tablets found in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library and palace archives. These tablets, numbering in the tens of thousands, constitute one of the most important archaeological finds in history. They include literary texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, scientific and mathematical treatises, religious hymns and prayers, historical chronicles, administrative records, royal correspondence, and much more. Some of these tablets are specifically dated, bearing colophons that identify when they were written. Many date to the reign of Ashurbanipal or to the later kings who ruled in Nineveh's final years. And then the sequence simply stops. Administrative records that had been maintained for years, carefully noting deliveries and expenditures and personnel, suddenly cease. The last entries date to the final year or months before the city fell. And then there is nothing. No transition, no explanation, just abrupt termination. Some tablets were found that appear to have been in the process of being written when they were abandoned. Partially inscribed tablets. Texts that seem incomplete. Arrangements that suggest scribes had been working, and then simply left or fled, never to return and finish their work. These are frozen moments, instances when normal administrative and scholarly activity was interrupted permanently. The tablets themselves bear witness to the fire. Properly manufactured clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia were sun-dried, but not fired. They were hard enough to handle and store, but they could be softened in water if corrections were needed. However, unfired clay tablets are not very durable over long periods, especially in damp conditions where they can dissolve back into mud. But the tablets from Nineveh were baked hard by the fire that destroyed the city. The same blaze that consumed the palace turned the tablets into fired ceramic, making them extraordinarily durable. Many show signs of this accidental firing. They are harder than they should be, sometimes warped or cracked from the heat, sometimes discolored by fire. In this ironic way, the destruction preserved the library that it destroyed, saving ancient knowledge by the same fire that consumed ancient buildings. When we examine the weaponry found at Nineveh, we find further specific testimony. The arrowheads are particularly informative. Ancient arrowheads varied by culture and period, and specialists can identify them by their shape, size, metallurgy, and manufacturing techniques. At Nineveh, archaeologists found concentrations of arrowheads at the walls and gates, exactly where we would expect fighting to have been most intense. These arrowheads were of different types. Some were bronze, some iron. Some were of styles typical of Assyrian manufacture, but others were characteristic of Babylonian production, and still others matched types known from Median contexts. This weapon typology confirms the written sources. The Babylonian Chronicle tells us that Babylon and Media allied to attack Nineveh. The arrowheads found in the ruins prove that Babylonian and Median archers did indeed participate in the siege and assault. These are the actual weapons fired during the battle, some of them still showing the impact damage from striking stone walls or embedding in wood or possibly in flesh. The iron arrowheads are particularly significant. Iron metallurgy in the late 7th century BC was more advanced in some regions than others. The median arrowheads show a sophistication in iron working that was characteristic of Iranian plateau peoples. The presence of these technologically advanced iron points among the destruction debris confirms median participation in the attack. Imagine these arrowheads being made in Median workshops, shaped and sharpened, then transported with the army on its march to Nineveh. Imagine them being distributed to archers before battle, perhaps hundreds or thousands of arrows for each assault. Imagine them being fitted to bowstrings, drawn, aimed and loosed toward the city's defenders. Some missed, some struck walls or shields, some found their targets, and those that missed were left behind, buried in the debris of the siege, to be found by archaeologists 26 centuries later. The calcined limestone provides another type of material testimony. As we've discussed, limestone undergoes a chemical transformation when exposed to sustained high heat. The presence of calcined limestone throughout the palace areas proves that the fires burned extraordinarily hot and for extended periods. This is not speculation or interpretation, but chemical fact. The calcium carbonate of limestone becomes calcium oxide at specific temperatures. The extent of calcination can even indicate approximate temperatures and duration of exposure. When archaeologists examined the palace ruins and found extensive calcination, they weren't making assumptions about the intensity of the fire. They were observing direct physical proof of extreme heat. Some of the relief slabs were found cracked into pieces, with the crack patterns characteristic of thermal stress. Stone expands when heated, and if different parts of a carved slab are heated unevenly, or if it's heated and then cooled suddenly, it can crack. The specific patterns of cracking in the Nineveh reliefs indicate exposure to intense, uneven heating, consistent with building fires. The human skeletal remains found in the destruction layers, provide grim but specific testimony to the violence of Nineveh's fall. When archaeologists find human bones in archaeological contexts, they can learn much from careful analysis. First, the location of the skeletons tells us something. These bodies were found in streets, in building collapses, at gates and walls, not in formal cemeteries or burial contexts. This indicates that these people died violently and were not given proper burial, a serious matter in ancient Mesopotamian culture, where proper burial rites were considered essential. Second, the bones themselves show evidence of trauma. Some skulls have fracture patterns indicating blunt force trauma, blows from weapons or falling debris. Some bones show cut marks from edged weapons, swords or axes slicing into flesh and cutting bone. Some skeletons have arrowheads or spear points still embedded in bone, the projectile that killed them still in place after more than 2.5 millennia. Third, analysis of the skeletal population shows a mix of ages and sexes, not just military-aged males. This suggests that civilians as well as soldiers died in the fall of Nineveh, that the violence was not limited to combatants. Animal remains also provide testimony. Skeletons of horses, donkeys, sheep, goats, and other animals were found in the destruction layers. Some in what had been stables or pens, others in streets. Like the human remains, many of these animals died violently and suddenly, their bodies left where they fell and buried in the collapse and ash. Some animal bones show butchering marks, suggesting that during the siege, as food supplies dwindled, animals that might normally have been kept for other purposes were slaughtered for meat. Work animals, riding horses, animals usually reserved for specific purposes all became potential food as the siege dragged on and hunger grew. The paleobotanical evidence, the analysis of ancient plant remains, adds yet another dimension. Throughout the destruction layer, archaeologists found charred seeds and grains. These organic materials would normally decay and disappear, but carbonization preserved them. They were burned but not consumed, turned into charcoal that could survive burial. The presence of charred grain in storage jars tells us that the city's food reserves were consumed in the fires. These jars had held grain stored against future need, grain that represented wealth and security, now transformed into carbonized waste. The burning of food stores was both practical destruction, denying sustenance to any survivors, and symbolic destruction, consuming the wealth of the city. Seeds from fruits like dates and figs were also found charred. These tell us about diet and agriculture in Nineveh's final days, but they also provide datable material. Organic materials can be dated using radiocarbon dating, and the charred seeds and grains from Nineveh, when tested, provided dates consistent with the late 7th century BC, confirming the historical dating of the destruction. Each artifact type, tablets, weapons, calcined stone, bones, seeds, provides specific material evidence. None of these artifacts can be dismissed as propaganda or myth-making. They are physical objects that can be examined, analyzed, dated, and compared with other evidence. Together, they build a comprehensive picture of what happened to Nineveh that is completely consistent with the written sources and with the overall archaeological context. When all this evidence is laid out, thousands of tablets, hundreds of arrowheads, tons of calcined stone, dozens of skeletons, countless seeds and animal bones, the cumulative weight of testimony becomes overwhelming. This is not circumstantial evidence or argumentation from probability. This is direct, physical proof of violent destruction in the late 7th century BC. We have examined the destruction of Nineveh from many angles. Historical texts, fortification damage, palace fires, temple violations, the stratigraphic destruction layer, siege evidence, systematic erasure, post-destruction abandonment, and the testimony of individual artifacts. Now, as we bring this long exploration toward its close, let us step back and see the complete picture that emerges when all these different types of evidence are brought together. The strength of the archaeological case for Nineveh's destruction in 612 BC lies not in any single piece of evidence, however dramatic, but in the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion. This is what makes the destruction of Nineveh one of the most thoroughly documented events in ancient history. Consider how different types of evidence corroborate each other. The Babylonian Chronicle, a historical text, tells us that Nineveh fell after a 3-month siege to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The archaeological evidence provides physical confirmation. The siege ramp at the Nergal Gate shows that siege warfare occurred. The weapon typology confirms that Babylonian and Median forces participated. The destruction layer dates to exactly the period when the Chronicle says the city fell. The biblical prophecies of Nahum speak of gates being opened by flooding, of fire consuming the city, of treasures being plundered. The archaeological evidence shows water-laid silt in lower areas, flooding, extensive calcination and ash layers, fire, and the absence of precious materials, plundering. Different sources, created for different purposes by different peoples, all describe the same events and are confirmed by the physical remains. The stratigraphic evidence, that crucial destruction layer, provides an objective chronological marker. Below it, the prosperous Assyrian city. Within it, ash, burnt debris, collapsed structures, evidence of catastrophic destruction. Above it, sterile soil or minimal poor quality settlement. This sequence allows no interpretation except catastrophic destruction, followed by abandonment. The uniformity of the destruction layer across the entire site rules out localized disasters, like accidental fires or earthquakes. When excavations in the Southwest Palace, the North Palace, the Shamash Gate, the Ishtar Temple, and residential areas all reveal the same thick ash layer at the same stratigraphic level, we can only conclude that a site-wide catastrophe occurred at a single point in time. The violence is written in multiple materials, in the breached walls and burned gates, in the calcined limestone and vitrified brick, in the defaced lamassu and toppled statues, in the arrowheads embedded in walls and bones, in the bodies left unburied where they fell. Each of these is a different form of evidence, preserved in different materials, but all telling the same story of violent assault and destruction. The systematic nature of the destruction emerges from details large and small. The presence of a siege ramp shows planning and engineering. The evidence of sapping suggests sophisticated siege techniques. The concentration of weapons at key defensive points shows where the heaviest fighting occurred. The pattern of looting, precious materials absent, bulky materials remaining, shows organization and efficiency. The defacing of royal and divine imagery shows deliberate iconoclasm, not random vandalism. The completeness of the abandonment that followed is equally well documented. The destruction layer is sealed, not disturbed by rebuilding. The post-Assyrian occupation is minimal and poor, not a continuation of urban life. The city's very location was eventually forgotten, something that could not happen if there had been continuous occupation, or even periodic reoccupation. Multidisciplinary approaches strengthen the case further. Archaeologists bring expertise in excavation and stratigraphy. Specialists in ancient languages read the cuneiform tablets. Art historians analyze the reliefs and sculptures. Weapons experts identify arrowhead types. Physical anthropologists examine skeletal remains. Paleobotanists study plant remains. Ceramic specialists analyze pottery. Each discipline contributes its specialized knowledge, and all their findings cohere into a consistent picture. The dating evidence from different sources converges remarkably. The Babylonian Chronicle provides a precise historical date, 612 BC. The pottery from the destruction layer dates stylistically to the late 7th century BC. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the destruction layer confirms a late 7th century date. The latest dated tablets from the palace archives end in the final years before 612 BC. Different dating methods, applied to different materials, all point to the same time frame. The archaeological documentation of Nineveh's destruction has accumulated over more than 150 years of excavation, from the pioneering work of Layard in the 1840s, through expeditions in the late 19th and 20th centuries, continuing with work in the early 21st century, though recent conflicts have damaged parts of the site and complicated further excavation. Each generation of archaeologists has added to the evidence base, employing increasingly sophisticated techniques and methods. Early excavators focused on recovering impressive artifacts. The relief sculptures, the lamassu, the tablets. Later excavators paid more attention to stratigraphy, to understanding the layers and their sequence. Modern excavators use scientific analysis, radiocarbon dating, chemical analysis of materials, digital recording, and modeling. Each approach has added to our understanding, and the accumulation of evidence over generations makes the case overwhelming. What we have, when we consider all this, evidence together, is not a hypothesis or interpretation that might be revised by new discoveries, but an established historical fact supported by an extraordinary weight of evidence. Nineveh was destroyed violently in 612 BC by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes after a 3-month siege. The city was looted, burned, and abandoned, never to be rebuilt as a major urban center. These events are as well documented archaeologically as any event from the ancient world. The destruction of Nineveh represents a pivot point in ancient Near Eastern history. The fall of the Assyrian capital effectively ended the Neo-Assyrian Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world. It shifted the balance of power to Babylon, which would dominate the region for the next century, until it too fell to Persia. It demonstrated that even the mightiest cities could fall, that empires were not eternal, that walls and armies and divine protection could fail. For those who lived through it, the destruction of Nineveh must have seemed like the end of the world. For Assyrians, it was the collapse of everything they knew, the defeat not just of their city, but of their gods, their culture, their way of life. For the peoples Assyria had conquered and oppressed, it may have seemed like divine justice, the punishment of a cruel empire. For the Babylonians and Medes who destroyed it, it was a great victory, the elimination of their enemy and rival. But from our perspective, 26 centuries later, the destruction of Nineveh is primarily a historical event that we can study and understand through the convergence of textual and archaeological evidence. It is a moment in time that has been frozen in ash and debris, preserved in destruction layers and broken artifacts, recorded in ancient texts and modern excavation reports. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind rest on this convergence of evidence, on the way that different types of testimony, words pressed into clay, stones buried in earth, bones laid in ash, all speak with one voice about what happened. There is something deeply satisfying about evidence that aligns so perfectly, about a historical event so thoroughly documented that we can know it with confidence, despite the vast gulf of time that separates us from it. The tells of Nineveh still stand on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, near the modern city of Mosul in Iraq. Some areas have been excavated and can be visited. Other areas remain unexcavated, still concealing beneath the surface additional evidence of the city that was and the destruction that ended it. The site has suffered damage in recent conflicts, with some areas destroyed by looting or deliberate demolition, adding modern destruction to ancient catastrophe. But the essential story is preserved, documented in museums around the world where the artifacts reside, recorded in excavation reports and scholarly studies, embodied in the site itself where the destruction layer still lies sealed beneath the earth, waiting for future archaeologists with new questions and new methods to examine it again and draw out further understanding. Nineveh fell. The evidence proves it. The texts describe it. The archaeology confirms it. And the city's long silence, its centuries of abandonment and forgetting, testify to how complete that destruction was. What had been one of the greatest cities of the ancient world became a memory, then a legend, then a forgotten tale, and finally, through the work of archaeologists, a rediscovered testament to the power of both human achievement and human destruction. Rest now, knowing that even the greatest catastrophes of the past can be understood, that time buries but also preserves, that the patient work of archaeological investigation can bring to light the truth of what happened millennia ago. The destruction layer waits in the earth, silent and patient, bearing witness across the centuries to one summer month in 612 BC, when the walls were breached, when the fires were lit, when Nineveh fell, and the world changed. Let these images drift through your mind as sleep approaches. The silent mounds under the stars, the buried palaces, the baked tablets, the ash layers, the broken statues, all resting quietly in the earth, all telling their story to those patient enough to listen, all confirming through their material presence the historical reality of events long past. The convergence of evidence speaks clearly, speaks certainly, speaks its testimony across 26 centuries. Nineveh fell, and archaeology proves it, fact by fact, layer by layer, artifact by artifact, until the truth is undeniable and complete. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy this video. If you did, please subscribe and click the bell icon to receive notifications about new videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.